So I'm really excited to be here today. I want to acknowledge that we proposed this session relative to some work that our team has been doing in the Brazilian Cerrado that's supported by the NASA Land Cover and Land Use Change Program. So thank you to NASA and the Luck Luck program for bringing us all here today, and this was the impetus for organizing this session. I also want to say, how many people have heard of the Cerrado before coming to this session? Nice. Not everybody in the room. How many people have been to the Cerrado? Great. Well, we found everybody in the cares about the Cerrado, I think. But I think also our goal is to spread awareness about this amazing biome and its unique richness, as well as the challenges from the land system science perspective. So hopefully today that will fill that niche. Thank you, Ani. And for people who came in late, we have an A and a B session. During the B session, which starts at 3:30, I believe, 3:15. We will have a lot of time for discussion, so please bring your questions then. Our next talk number 2, is Understanding and Tackling Deforestation Havens, the Case of the Amazon Cerrado Nexus in Brazil, with Mayron presenting. I also want to tell you that the flow, if you look at the agenda, we're kind of moving from deforestation through agriculture to environmental impacts and towards some solutions. So hopefully leaving this session on a high note, not just depression about deforestation.
Thanks, Gillian. This is going to be the depression. To wake you up from your, post-lunch dip. Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, everybody. My name is Myron Bastos Lima, Brazilian as well. Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And in the next 10 minutes that I've got, I'll try to elaborate on these theoretical musings I've had. I'm a governance scholar, so you won't see many numbers here. You can think of this as some sort of land use algebra for a change. You're getting plenty of numbers in the other presentations. But hopefully this will, be some form of mind candy or stimulate your thinking. Because it's been very helpful that Annie has already set the stage and prepared the ground with the facts about the Cerrado's importance and what's happening to it. And those of you familiar with the biome and what's been happening to it in the last few decades already know that it experiences persistent deforestation, no matter how much we emphasize that it's important for this, for water, for biodiversity, because of the communities. Doesn't matter. We seem to be speaking to the wall. And there is also the question that perhaps the fault is that all the attention goes to the Amazon, and the Cerrado is a dumping ground, a sacrifice zone, boi de piranha, which is the cattle that you toss to the piranhas so that you can cross the river with the rest. Anyway, how can you actually make sense of this in a more structured, analytical way? And that's what I decided to resort to the scholarship on pollution havens to try to think if there could be an equivalent in thinking of the Cerrado then as a deforestation haven. And the thoughts I've had is what I'm sharing with you today. For those of you that are not too familiar with environmental studies writ large beyond land use, the pollution haven hypothesis came about around the 90s when, because of climate change policies coming to the fore, and also policies to combat pollution from industries, it was realized that in a globalized economy where we're getting to have, industries could move the way traders and commodity production nowadays can move. We're very familiar with this, and therefore they would move, according to this hypothesis, to least regulated areas. It was tested among states inside the United States, and if a state or a country in a ever more open, at least to capital flows, globalized world, if you raise the regulation, you run the risk of losing money. You lose investments because companies, industries will simply relocate. And that is called industrial flight. They go away. Of course, those of you who are familiar with this from before will say, yes, but it's been proven and disproven indeed. There are many cases where it holds, where it doesn't hold. So think of it as an analytical concept. And this is what I came up with. If we think of it, it won't take you long to realize that here, for instance, the Amazon could be area A, whereas the Cerrado could be area B. I would like to think that it's not so simple that, as some publications seem to claim out there, that because of the soy moratorium, the Cerrado gets deforested. I'm very skeptical about single cause explanations, as I think everybody should be. But we have a number of pull factors that may work differentially to different areas. It's important to realize that these pull factors are driver specific. You can think of soy if you want to work this out in your mind. And various factors, economic, topographical, social, ecological, agronomic, can influence that difference and make a certain area more attractive to that driver and therefore experience more land use change than another, irrespective of the protections. But difficulties of all these forms, because it's more expensive, because it's logistically more challenging, or because it's better environmentally protected, may all operate not as pull factors, but as the opposite, as deterrent factors. And this language is commonly used, for example, in migration studies. Nowadays, it's one of the main global phenomena, and you think, why would someone coming from Syria would move to a refugee, would move to Sweden and not to Germany? People are studying these things, and they refer to those factors as deterrent factors. Then, after a conservation intervention, such as, for example, the soy moratorium, or such as the UDR applying only over the Amazon in Brazil's case and not over other woodlands, you have an increase in deterrent factors there. And then you have not just what we could call land use flight. You also have deflected pressure, because I talked to plenty of people. This was underscored by over 50 interviews that I did with key informants in Brazil. And the next slide will be a bit more empirical. But while here on the concept, many people said, this whole leakage story is bollocks, because it's not like, so one or two individuals claimed, it's not that people left, packed their bags from the Amazon and then went to deforest in the Cerrado. That would be land use flight. But it's very important to also be mindful of deflected new pressure, new investments that perhaps, theoretically at least, could have come there that are less likely to do so because the protections are higher, whereas the other place remains less protected. So everything's relative. These are some factors. We're very used to thinking of some of them, but there are others. Just look at a few things that won't be strange to you who are familiar with both biomes. We all know that soy was optimized for the Cerrado soil some decade ago, and that unlocked the potential for it to take over lands that previously were deemed unavailable. We have the economic attractiveness because land prices are affordable. It's closer to domestic markets. Annie pointed out how protected areas are just a small fraction of the Cerrado, whereas in the Amazon, that's a much higher number. The legal reserve that private farmers are obliged to have is much lower. On top of it, we have a soy moratorium in the case of this specific driver, even if it might be on its last legs. According to some, it's been there. But we also have the soft protections, right? The Amazon burning gets the president of France to go on Twitter and post something. The Cerrado disappearing, he doesn't even know what the Cerrado is, probably. I would bet money on that. It's little known even inside Brazil. And the same if we think of the communities. The flagship communities in the Amazon, indigenous people, they will be meeting up with the Secretary General of the UN. They will be meeting up with heads of state. And it's great that that happens. It's just unfortunate that the converse is not true for flagship communities such as the Quilombola, Afro-Brazilians in the Cerrado, who most Brazilians don't even know that they exist. I'm sure if I pull a cousin of mine or someone who's not from this field and speak of quilombos, they will think of history classes like, oh, yeah, from the 17th century, right? Like, no, they still exist. No, you're kidding me. It's not sad. So sometimes I wonder, and the same goes for the more pure biodiversity type. The jaguar is used for the Amazon, as are a few other species, and the maned wolf is hardly known in those iconic animal rankings that some organizations make. I think every Brazilian in the room will agree that the current government has helped a number of things, but sucks hard when it comes to communication. I think one area where they could work beyond working on the legal protections that we're all skeptical that can happen given the Congress we've got in place and that we're likely to have in the near future, communication about this would be so important, both on a national and on a global level. So these all can be regarded as levers for making that parallel between the two biomes more equalized. Anyway, these are the key points I wanted to drive to you in these 10 minutes. We can think of those places to which pressures are deflected to as deforestation havens, because in a relative sense, for drivers that can move about, they will be the lowest point that they can be drawn towards. That prompts us to think of the meta-level dynamics across biomes. So we shouldn't ever think of biomes individually nowadays, when we know that ecologically they are connected, but also from a policy and governance perspective, with the kind of economic environment we've got in the last decades, it's of paramount importance that we think of such meta-level dynamics when a conservation intervention is introduced, or even when we are thinking of stronger, stricter policies for a given biome. We need to think of what happens to the neighbor. And finally, ideally, we would be addressing the demand for these problematic production processes. But in the absence of that, we need to think of the nexus between the two. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you. Our third presenter is Ariane Rodriguez. Ariane's talk is titled, How Can We Increase Crop Production Without Deforestation? Dynamics of Agricultural Expansion in the Cerrado and Lessons Learned. If you're looking around for Ariane, she wasn't able to make it here with us today, but Marcia Macedo is presenting on her behalf.
Thanks, Gillian. Let's see. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be presenting on behalf of Ariane, although I wish she was here with us, and hope to do her work justice. This is work that she started during her PhD and is continuing in a postdoc at the University of Vermont. Ani did a great job of setting me up, so I won't belabor the point, but the Cerrado is a really important biodiversity hotspot with all sorts of hydrological, biological, and social functions, and a really important biome that is underappreciated. And it is also the focus of agricultural production in Brazil. So half of all the soybean areas in Brazil and 50% of the national cattle herd in the Cerrado. So that kind of sets up this tension that we've been hearing about. Just to recap some of the information that Ani presented, about 51% of the Cerrado is still remaining, and 38% of that could be legally deforested. Whether or not it is actually legally deforested with a license is to be debated, but about 38% of that could be legally deforested. And that is because it really has low environmental protection. Again, you've seen this before, about 7% of the biome in formal protected areas, 4%, a little bit more now in indigenous lands. So a total of 11% is under protection. And that means that there's a lot of room for land clearing and processes that are sort of uncontrolled. And so the focus of this project is really trying to understand, whether deforestation is really required to increase agricultural production in the biome, and what are the land use transitions that kind of explain, what's going on. We know that agriculture is projected to increase, and as is beef production in all of Latin America, and the Cerrado is no exception. We have some opportunities for intensifying production in some regions using double cropping and sort of more efficient cropping methods. And we have a huge area of underutilized pastures. Most of the pastures have very low stocking density. So there are some opportunities for maybe using land more efficiently to increase productivity. And so this idea that deforestation is required to advance agricultural production and thereby economic development in the Cerrado may be a false dilemma in a lot of cases. And so Ariane has been digging into the data to see kind of what evidence there is one way or the other. Deforestation rates remain high. Ani also alluded to this. This graph goes a little bit further back in time, so nowhere near as high as they were in the early 2000s, but this is no surprise to the audience here. This is cumulative, right? So every year that we continue deforestation with less native vegetation is more of the biome and all of its functions that are lost. From 2000 to 2014, about 80% of all cropland expansion occurred over pasturelands. And the Mato Piba region, which is that region that Ani highlighted in the states of Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia, accounted for about 93% of the increase in deforestation. A point to think about here is that agriculture drives deforestation both directly and indirectly, right? So these land use transitions that I'll get into a little bit more, and that land speculation and unclear land tenure are a really important part of that process, as well as the sort of economic ups and downs, the external markets that are driving some of these land uses. So really thinking about land speculation as a potential driver of some of these changes. So the goals of this project are really to understand the land use transitions and kind of the dynamics over time with an eye towards identifying intervention points that can help us reduce deforestation. And Ani also relied a lot on this data set, but just to highlight that the Mapioma's sort of data cube based on the Landsat time series is a really important tool to understand these land use transitions, and one that it's a recent addition on the scene. It's allowed us to really look through time to understand how these transitions are evolving over time. And I won't read these to you, but these are kind of the categories that land use categories that we're interested in. Another important data set is a crop suitability data set that was produced by AgroSatellite. There are others, but that's the one that we're using in this project. It has 4 classes of soil and climate suitability, so high, medium, low, and unsuitable, crossed with slope and altitude restrictions. And just to point out that most of the croplands are in areas of high or moderate suitability, so about 93% of the harvest in 2013 to 2014 was in areas of moderate to high suitability. So these are the main land use transitions. I'm not going to read them out to you, but these 4 account for the largest area and are the ones that we're focusing on. So I'll zoom in on those. Pasture expansion over native vegetation, which is the largest sort of land area. Vegetation encroachment over pasture. This could also be regeneration. It's sort of all lumped, so it could be like woody encroachment or regeneration. Cropland expansion over native vegetation, and cropland expansion over pasture. So if we look over time at those land categories, we see, not surprisingly, that the native vegetation is declining over time. The pasture area is really quite stable. So there's, it's sort of expanding as cropland expands over pasture. We see pasture lands opening up in other ways. And it's pretty dynamic. This is lumped for the entire Cerrado, and you can see that it's pretty dynamic over time. See a big change here in 2011, 2012. Maybe some fodder for discussion of what might be driving that later. we see that there are some kind of connections between these land use transitions. So there's sort of in general, when croplands are expanding over native vegetation, they're also expanding over pastures. So there's incentives kind of to expand croplands go across land uses. On the other hand, when pasture is expanding over native vegetation, we see less sort of recuperation, less regeneration of native vegetation over pasture. But this is very variable. So when we zoom in to the different states, we see that the patterns are quite distinct, right? They don't mirror what's happening when you lump the entire Cerrado. So I'll just point out Piauí here, almost all of the area in cropland expanded over native vegetation over the entire history of land use change in that state. And here are some of the other states in the Cerrado. Again, very, very different kind of land use histories and land use transitions in each of those locations. So it speaks a little bit to the sort of idea that we need to understand kind of in a more granular sense what's happening on the ground to understand what's driving these changes regionally. Of concern, or just a fact to know, is that most of the remaining area, so a very large area, half of the remaining area of native vegetation is in zones of high crop suitability, so still a lot of potential for expansion. This doesn't account for kind of future climate suitability, which I think Ludmila Hachis will touch on in a session later this afternoon. And we see kind of an expansion of new frontiers for croplands. And so rather than sort of this expansion out from areas that were always cropped through government incentives and other sort of economic incentives, we've seen a big push in the Mato Piba region for agricultural expansion, very far from the consolidated zones from earlier expansion. So that's kind of a new, not new, but new in the context of the time series that we're talking about. So in the last 10, 15 years. And a point that we're really itching to kind of dig into a little bit further is that pastures can be a transitional land use, right? And we've seen this, that yes, pasture is the largest area of sort of the initial land conversion, but not all of it is necessarily destined for beef production, and there is evidence in some regions that it's a transitional land use, that it's really part of sort of land grabbing, land speculation as these frontiers develop, and some tidbits that point in that direction. So of the 27 million hectares of Cerrado, 28% of Cerrado agriculture, 28% replaced pasture, but about a quarter of that is pastures that were less than 7 years old. And going back to Piauí, almost all of it was in pastures that were less than 5 years old. So there's some evidence that there's sort of greenwashing that's happening in the sense of, you convert the land to pasture, you wait a few years, either you sell that land or you convert it to cropland production yourself. And that allows you to then access international markets that want deforestation-free croplands, right? So the beef is mostly being sold to domestic markets, which don't necessarily have a deforestation-free requirement, and so that's kind of a potential loophole that it's hard to prove, but we're definitely going to dig into that a little bit more and see if there's any evidence of that in some of these regions. So in closing, local and regional dynamics play a key role in understanding these land use transitions. We see that a lot of indirect factors are underlying deforestation and agricultural expansion. This idea that land speculation is really driving some of this pasture expansion is something that we certainly see in the Amazon, and seems to be at play for at least some portion of the land pool. There is certainly still a lot of open land that is underutilized for pasture production, and some plenty of opportunities to sort of push agricultural expansion into those regions rather than allowing further deforestation. This question of the vegetation encroachment over pastures is another area where we really want to understand a little bit more how much of that is temporary, how much of it is actual regeneration, how much of it is kind of degraded pastures that are suffering woody encroachment that doesn't really ever kind of move forward into a native vegetation class. So some future questions that we'll be digging into and hopefully presenting in future meetings. So thank you. And this is the team.
Marcia is getting me the list of who's next. Is it you, Erasmus? And just a reminder that we have a second session starting at 3:15, so please come back. We have a few talks, and then we'd like to have a broad discussion. So we welcome lots of questions then. You can use this one. Oh, you want?
Super. So I think by now everyone has kind of got the picture that the land use dynamic in the Cerrado is pretty complex. But what this talk is going to focus on is the transition from native vegetation, savanna, grasslands, and forests into pastures, which is, in the last 20 years, more than half of the clearance. And even though it actually makes up such a large portion of the land use dynamic, and even though in this session it's actually been talked about, in general, I would say that it's kind of ignored. And it sort of pales in comparison to the conversation that happens around soybean expansion in the biome. So I'm going to make the case that cattle ranching in the Cerrado is super important, and that it actually has received relatively little attention. In terms of it being important, well, it's the single biome with the most cattle. It has around a third of the pasture expansion in the country, not that far behind what happens in the Amazon, where it gets a lot more attention. And it's also the location of a lot of in agriculture investment. So more than 40% of the cattle-related credit is actually granted to ranchers in the Cerrado. Okay, cattle ranching in the Cerrado is big. It has a large impact. So what is the state of play of the sort of voluntary market-led governance? It is a familiar story, but in comparison with the Amazon, it's less protected. So since 2009, we've had a series of sort of meat packer commitments to reduce deforestation in cattle supply chains. The equivalent for the Cerrado was only launched in April of this year. The Protocolo do Cerrado is a voluntary initiative launched by a small number of companies, which basically mirrors the commitment that was made in the Amazon. It has 11 criteria. Your suppliers must be registered. You must have a property polygon. They set a deforestation cutoff. They used a very recent one, the beginning of 2021. And then you're meant to screen your suppliers for forced labor, cattle purchases from indigenous lands, quilombolas, and other land use types. Okay, so the protocol is a nice sort of set of criteria. What does that mean in practice? Only 5 meat packers signed it, and 2 retail companies. So it's actually a very limited scope. And the second thing about it is that it's actually just a criteria list. It's not yet clear if these companies will even apply the protocol, and it's not yet clear if they do apply it, how they will report it, and whether this will be transparent. So there's a protocol. This is encouraging, it's new, but it's very uncertain. The sort of good news is that it's backed up by a commitment by the Meat Export Association, ABIEC, who said that they will basically protect all biomes in Brazil. And so there is sort of an expectation, again, theoretical, that ABIEC will adopt this protocol across all their member companies, maybe 50 or so companies, which could potentially increase the coverage of the protection of the biome. Okay, so this presentation has that all as a background, and we want to kind of answer this question. So what is the prospect for sustainable cattle ranching in the Cerrado. And I will answer 4 questions. So first of all, what is the market share of the Protocolo signatories? So what is the protection from the companies who have already signed? And to do this, we use lists of all the slaughterhouses which are in the biome or source large volumes of cattle from the biome. We use animal transport records to estimate their size, and then we calculate market share. Number 2, okay, we know who's buying, who has high risks. So who's buying cows from places with conversion. And to do this, we cross data on the sourcing of each of those slaughterhouses with map biomas data on the where cattle ranching expansion is occurring into native vegetation. Next, we say, okay, great, that's the risk per meat packer. Who are they selling to? There, we take data from a citizen science initiative, Do Pasto ao Prato, that we launched 2-3 years ago, which is based on an app, and shoppers can register meat products in the supermarket, check the origin, but also contribute data to an initiative like this, so that we can see, for example, the origin of meat sold in Brasilia. And so we use that to track meat from the slaughterhouses in the Cerrado to consumers across the country. And lastly, I'm going to finish with my sort of Myron hat, where I'm going to reflect a little bit about the speed with which our governance initiatives adapt to the evolving data and threats. Okay, so question 1, what is the market share? So the current signatories, only 5 companies, actually cover about 40% of slaughter, 30% or so of the conversion in the Cerrado. And it's important to note that here we have all these data per slaughterhouse, per company, and the non-signatories who have the highest risks actually sit inside the legal Amazon region in the Cerrado, so in Tocantins, Maranhão. If ABIEC adopts, this could boost the coverage of the commitment a lot, to about 2/3, right? Both for slaughter and in terms of native vegetation conversion. But I just think, although that's like a large number, 2/3 of the market, we should think about, is 2/3 of the market enough for this to be truly effective? And there is still 1/3 of the market, which is a very long tail of smaller companies who will be very hard to engage, potentially suggesting limits to these voluntary sort of collaborative or collective action commitments. Okay, where does the meat from the Cerrado go? What we see is that around half of it goes to the southeast of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais. And in particular, I just want to flag the sort of teething problems of this protocol, of the Cerrado Protocol, which, what we already see is that even the supermarkets who signed it are buying from those same high-risk slaughterhouses that I, flagged up, the ones who don't have, who are not signatories. So there's still a disconnect between what the retailers say and who their suppliers are. And then I just want to finish with this reflection, that I think in some ways we've missed an opportunity to sort of learn quickly from the process in the Amazon. So in 2009, we had these sustainable procurement initiatives that were kicked off, and it was meant to protect the biome, the Amazon biome specifically. But the legal wording of the tax refers to the legal Amazon states. And so it's a shame in a way that we've had 8 years where we've had data on pasture conversion in the Cerrado, where we've lost, 63% of all this pasture expansion has happened inside the scope of the tax, but was not monitored by any of these companies who kept publishing sustainability reports about their incredible performance, which was 7.3 million hectares of pasture expansion. And even just since 2020, when this was already, very mature data, and where the protocol had long been discussed, we lost 1.4 million hectares of Cerrado. And I think this was maybe I'm too optimistic, but we did have 8 years that we lost, and maybe we should think about how our governance initiatives, we should build adaptation into them from the start. The Sustainable Procurement Initiative in the Amazon has just launched version 2, which still doesn't include the Amazon, the Cerrado. So we're expecting that maybe the protocol will cover this gap, but definitely there was an opportunity there to think when we push the private sector to make commitments, we should build in the adaptation into the process from the beginning, because you need to adapt. Finally, just my summary. I think the cattle ranching in the Cerrado is super important, a little bit ignored. The new initiative has relatively low market share. Even if the largest collection of meat packers does adopt, as they say they should, it does still lead about a third of the Cerrado uncovered, which means that we should not place too much faith in these market level government initiatives. It really needs to be a policy mix in order to address conversion across the biome. And ideally, we would learn mistakes from the past, making our government's initiatives more responsive. This is such a good session, so I want to collaborate with everybody. We will publish these numbers in February after Christmas, because retailers are only thinking about Christmas now. But that means we also have 4 months. So if you want to, provide input, we would love to refine our messaging and think about how we can, use this data to sort of drive impact. I thank my team, the great people from the Paso Prato, and then all the partners who also help make it happen, who contributed data, who participate, who help do messaging, etc. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, everybody was really on time. I think we probably told people they had a few minutes less than they actually did, and they kept to time. So we do have some time for questions or discussion if anyone wants to ask anything about the presentations. Yeah, let me grab the other microphone. I'll give you this one.
Thank you. My question relates to what we had this morning in the plenary session. How do you make such a small, what will be called a case study approach to influence global actions? Because reading about Cerrado looks like what most of us are told. We are looking at local scale kind of studies, and how then do we want to scale this up to influence discussions globally? Do you have any plans or ideas? Because I can see you're also talking about governance issues. So,
great question. Anyone?
I can begin. I think when we put the spotlight on the poor cousins of the dyadic relationship, we all hear about Southeast Asian forests, the Congo Basin forests, the Amazon. We don't hear as much about savannas in East Africa or other ecosystems that are less talked about. So I think some of the lessons here can well be taken for thinking also in other continents beyond these ones we're discussing. To give one example, the same happens to the Chaco in the more southern part of South America, where it is also neglected because it is a dry forest without such iconic species that jump to our head. But that doesn't mean that there is no biological and cultural value. So I think calling out on that neglect is a starting point.
Just a clear reflection on that is even like the EUDR, commitments, in a way, if it's not forest, it doesn't matter. So I agree with Mariam. Maybe we have a role there in pushing for the importance of these biomes, because they do in the case of Cerrado, they do provide lots of water for most of the Brazilian population, but we are not right there yet. I think I don't know how actually to engage people in, and even national, imagine internationally, to speak about the importance of this biome.
I think one example on the method side also is like with map biomas. There was incredible success within Brazil, and it's rapidly spread. I don't know to how many countries now, but 14 countries, right? Where it's really driven by people in country who have both the technical expertise, but also the knowledge of the land system. So I think there's opportunity also to use, maybe something that starts small, but to help us learn in other ways. I know the time series I was showing, 10, 15 years ago did some analysis in Malawi, which is a maize-dominated system. It looks a little bit different than Brazil because it's smallholder agriculture, but those same methods can be used in other places. So I think also dialogue about what's happening in different places helps us spread. This afternoon we'll hear about a case study of one of these invisible communities, and I think even just talking about one of those communities helps us sort of bring some of the cotton out of our eyes to think about them more globally, or at least within the Cerrado. So.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ana Reboredo Segovia. I work at the World Resources Institute. I'm here with some of the rest of our team that's working on non-forest ecosystem conversion. So I really appreciate this session and what you guys have been talking about today. My question is more about your use of the word pasture, and also the parts of the Cerrado that are more on the open side, more of the grassland side. A lot of the Cerrado that has pasture on it, it's planted pasture, right? And it has like a lot of exotic species coming from Africa. What are the other dynamics? Are there other dynamics in the Cerrado of pastures, of livestock grazing on natural lands? And at what point do you think that it becomes a issue of conversion where these native areas are so degraded that it's okay to do something like put crops on them? Broad question. We can talk more later, but yeah, that's what I want to ask.
I'll answer your first part really quickly because I think we had an expert blind spot that we didn't sort of define. The first one is, what is a pasture? And you're absolutely right. It can, in this area, range from brachiaria grasses, which are pastures from Africa, to native grasslands and such. So there's a wide range, and Ani can speak more about how people are addressing that. But all sorts of things happen in pasture, from pastures getting quote-unquote dirty or having encroachment of undesirable species to reformation, restoration for production, and so on. And the other thing is, we all use the word deforestation, but as Ani pointed out, the Cerrado is a big mix, right? From forest all the way down to grassland. In Brazil, in Portuguese, the term used for native vegetation conversion is deforestation, and that we should have defined that for the whole audience. Does anyone else want to speak to this other question?
Just as almost everybody talked about using Mapioma's data, I should say that when we mentioned pasture there, we were talking about planted pasture, most with exotic species. Which, because we captured the conversion part. And so, yeah, but there are many people that do grazing in natural pastures, and most of them actually are small and medium holders, like landholders. Large holders, usually they actually, if they want to do business, they convert the land to planted pasture, which is not the same for Pantanal, for example, which is a totally different situation, even though it's also a system dominated by grasslands, native grasslands.
Yeah, may I? Okay. Gustavo Oliveira from the University of Bonn. First, I would like to thank you all to setting this up, because I loved the session. Really, it was great, all the presentations. And I even loved more when Myron also said that we should not only blame the Amazon soy moratorium as the only cause for the deforestation problem in Cerrado. I think that you are completely right. But that said, I think that I just have a very general and open question. it seems that most of the deforestation is taking place in the Matopiba area. And the question is, why? Because we are not so sure what is really driving the deforestation in Cerrado, right? What are the mechanisms behind it? I don't know, maybe it's just because that area you have more more secure property rights for foreign investments, or are there better agroclimatic conditions? The local weather is better for agriculture there, or the soil is more fertile? What do you guys think that could be the reasons behind this concentration in the Matopiba area?
So that's a really good question, and probably everybody who thinks about Matopiba has a different answer or something to contribute. It's actually a shorter wet season there, so there's a lot more reliance on irrigation, so it may not actually be more suitable in a climate perspective. Gil Pontius up here, his project with Gustavo Oliveira. Gustavo is studying the political ecology of irrigation in Western Bahia specifically. So please be in touch with them. He has some really good understanding what's happening and sort of the marginalization of peasant farmers, particularly in riparian zones in the interests of large-scale irrigation infrastructure. Marcia, you might have a question or an answer to this also. I know, Anya, people at EPOM have done surveys about producers who started in Western Bahia and moved further north, and some of the reasons they bought land there. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, part of the deforestation is happening there is because that is where there is vegetation to be deforested. But in fact, there are many. I mean, it's a less populated. I shouldn't say that because there are many invisibilized or invisible communities living there, but it is a less populated region, and also they have these plateaus, so there is some topographic also conditions good for mechanization, even though they have to drill for water. And also because they found all these topographic areas, there was establishment of very good infrastructure for silos, I don't know how to say, silos and all like the infrastructure for mechanized agriculture. So I guess it's not so far from ports, for example, like to send the production. So I think it's a mix of a bunch of things, and I would say that the least thing is the climate, because the climate is what really can mess up a little bit.
Just to add briefly, Annie has already enlisted most of the factors, but just to wear my political scientist hat, I've done interviews there, and if you look at where the Cerrado is placed, especially in Maranhão, Piauí, and Bahia, it's quite far from where the state capitals are. And typically those are the backyards of the respective states where basically you've had neglected areas. There's that's also why you've had Geraizeiros and other communities that kind of survived, because they were basically neglected there. Let them be. They're in the backyard of the civilized part of the state. And if you look, all those states have had left-wing governments for the last almost 20 years. So it's even ironic that you have strong agribusiness that is very Bolsonaro aligned there, but it's been a bargain. That's been also a sacrifice zone on the state level. In Bahia, my home state, that's definitely the case. Beyond the San Francisco River, that's who cares? We don't even think of that as part of the state. It's been kind of handed over to the private sector as a bargaining chip for political support at the state level. So just to add.
I think there was one case study I had heard of producers who had bought land. They had left Western Bahia and bought land deeper into Matopiba, and part of it was they had capital, but what I understand from the survey is they were saying that they bought land in that part of Matopiba because the prices were cheap and the people were illiterate. So they could offer what the people felt was a good price, but the people just didn't know that it really wasn't a good price. So there's sort of a land grabbing aspect, I think, in some cases also to be looking at.
Yeah, if you look the map of public lands, they are concentrated in that region as well. And one of the students from Eugenio Arima there, he used to work at IPAM before, and his name is Daniel. He studied almost like the crop rotation and like the pasture. In a line in what Marcia presented, and is very big the land speculation, but not with the land. I mean, how can I explain that? It's like the people, they gain twice when they go to the land. The forest, they gain in the first time when they convert to pasture, and then right away they gain more if they convert to crops. It's not like the Amazon. People go there, just the forest, and they speculate with the land with time. In the Cerrado, is a little bit different type of speculation. Do you want to talk about this, Eugenio? Sorry to put in the spot, but you. I think this land issue is very important.
Well, back to your original question, I think the most important point is, well, it's the hotspot for deforestation because it is where the forests are. But the second point, I think, if there's a map where they showed the gradient of the Cerrado, the southern part is, there's sugarcane encroaching, and the prices of land there are stratospheric. And therefore, as you go north, land is much cheaper. So there's this incentive. Yes, what Daniel found was this flipping of the land use is very quick. We don't understand exactly if it's multiple owners. So one person gets the land, deforests, plant pastures, and then a second one comes and converts immediately to cropland. Because if it were one single owner, it wouldn't make much sense to do that twice, right? Especially because Cerrado is pretty much easy to convert directly from forest, well, the Cerrado savanna to cropland. So it's unclear exactly how many people are involved in this very quick flip of land use.
I just have a suggestion, especially to people who are doing remote sensing. One thing that is missing is the expansion of forest plantation. If you go to, for example, southern Maranhão, you can see that they're spreading all over the place. Even on not really very suitable land, for example, soil, there is this limitation. You need flat land. Forest plantation, there's no need for that. So pay attention to that.
Okay, so thank you all. This was a great discussion. And we have a session B, which starts in the next session. I believe that's at what time? 3:15. And we have some presentations on sort of the interactions of climate and environment with land use in the Cerrado, as well as a presentation on restoration efforts and a Quilombo community working on seed collection, which will be really interesting. And I hope we can have more discussion after that. So see you then, 3:15, same room.